The wall cracked without warning, a sharp, violent sound like a gunshot that echoed down the narrow street. At first, people thought it was thunder, because the sky was low and gray and the air smelled of rain and dust. Then another crack followed, longer this time, and chunks of old mortar began to rain down from the side of the abandoned building that loomed over the sidewalk like a tired giant. Shouts erupted. Someone screamed. Shoes scraped against concrete as people scattered in every direction, fear moving faster than thought. Elias had been sitting against the alley wall across the street, counting the last coins in his palm, when he heard it. He looked up and saw the bricks shifting, the wall bowing outward in a slow, terrifying curve. Beneath it stood a woman in a pale designer coat, her phone pressed to her ear, her face confused rather than afraid, as if her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. One of her heels was caught between uneven stones, trapping her in place. She tried to step back and stumbled instead. For a fraction of a second, Elias froze. He was used to being invisible, used to watching danger pass other people by while it found him instead. His ribs still ached from sleeping on concrete, and his left arm was stiff from an old injury that never healed right. But something ancient and instinctive surged through him, louder than fear, louder than pain. He dropped the coins and ran. "Move," he shouted, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the grinding roar of brick and stone. The wall gave another groan, deeper now, like the building itself was crying out in warning. Elias reached her just as a large chunk of masonry broke free and smashed onto the sidewalk inches from her feet. Dust exploded into the air, stinging his eyes. He grabbed her shoulders and shoved with all the strength he had left in his body. She cried out, the phone flying from her hand, skidding across the pavement. They both fell hard, rolling just as the wall finally collapsed. Bricks slammed down where they had stood moments before, the impact shaking the ground beneath them. A deafening crash swallowed the street, followed by a choking cloud of dust that turned daylight into a gray fog. Pain ripped through Elias's back as something heavy struck him. He tasted blood, metallic and warm, and felt a sharp burn along his arm. The woman lay beside him, coughing, her eyes wide with shock, her hands clawing at his sleeve as if she was afraid to let go. Around them, people shouted names, called for help, cried in relief. Somewhere, a car alarm wailed. Sirens grew louder in the distance. Elias tried to push himself up, but his arm gave out beneath him. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to breathe, focusing on the simple fact that the woman was alive. He could see it in the rise and fall of her chest, in the way she stared at the rubble that would have crushed her flat if she'd stayed where she was. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. Elias nodded once, though the world tilted dangerously when he did. "You're safe," he said, his voice hoarse. That seemed to be enough for her. She let out a broken sob and pressed her forehead to the ground, shaking. Paramedics arrived, kneeling beside them, asking questions Elias barely heard. Hands lifted debris off his back, and the sudden release made him gasp in pain. They wanted to put him on a stretcher, to take him to the hospital. He shook his head, forcing himself to sit up despite the protest of every muscle. He'd learned long ago what hospital bills meant to someone like him. "I'm fine," he muttered, already pulling away. The woman tried to say something, thanks, maybe, or his name, but he didn't wait. While attention focused on the wreckage and the well-dressed survivor, Elias slipped into the thinning crowd, limping toward the side streets. By the time the dust settled and questions began, he was gone, leaving behind only a few dark drops of blood on the pavement and a town that didn't yet understand what it had witnessed. The town didn't stop talking after the wall fell. By the next morning, the story had spread from the street to every cafe, barber shop, and office break room. People argued over details, how close the woman had been, how fast the man had moved, whether anyone else would have done the same. Someone posted shaky phone footage online, the moment of collapse looping endlessly, the blur of a figure rushing forward just before the screen filled with dust. No one could clearly see his face. To most, he was just a shadow with a name no one knew. Clara Whitmore watched the video alone in her kitchen, her untouched coffee growing cold. Each time she replayed it, her chest tightened. She remembered the force of the shove, the rough fabric of his sleeve under her fingers, the way his voice had sounded, steady, almost gentle, amid the chaos. She owed her life to a stranger who had vanished without even giving his name. For someone used to having answers, contacts, and solutions on demand, the not knowing was unbearable. She started asking questions. At the construction office, at the nearby shops, at the police station. Most people shrugged. A few offered guesses. Probably one of the guys who sleeps by the river, someone said. I've seen him around, another added, but couldn't say where. The police had bigger problems than tracking down a man who didn't want to be found. Clara left each conversation more frustrated than the last. Days passed. The media interest faded, replaced by the next small-town drama. But Clara's determination hardened. She changed the way she moved through town, slowing down, looking instead of rushing. She walked streets she'd only ever driven past, noticed the encampments under bridges and behind old warehouses. Faces met her gaze with suspicion, then indifference. She realized how rarely she had truly seen any of them before. On the fourth evening, as the sky darkened to a bruised purple, she found him. He sat beneath the old railway bridge, the smell of damp concrete and oil thick in the air. His arm was wrapped in a filthy bandage, already stained through. He was threading a needle with hands that trembled slightly, his jaw clenched in concentration. Clara stopped a few steps away, her breath catching. "It was you," she said softly. Elias looked up, eyes narrowing at first, ready to be dismissed or chased off. Recognition flickered, then surprise. He lowered the needle. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not unkindly. "I've been looking for you," Clara replied. Up close, she could see how pale he was, how exhaustion sat deep in the lines of his face. Guilt pressed down on her chest. "You're hurt," he shrugged. "It'll heal." She pulled out an envelope from her coat and held it out. "Please, take this. For the hospital. For anything you need." Elias didn't reach for it. His gaze drifted past her, toward the dark water beyond the bridge. "I didn't do it for money," he said quietly. "And money doesn't fix everything." The words struck her harder than anger would have. She lowered the envelope, unsure of what to say next. "Then let me help," she tried. "In some way." He met her eyes then, and she saw no bitterness there, only a tired honesty. "Helping is letting people keep their dignity," he said. "I saved you because it was right. That's all." Silence stretched between them, filled by the distant rumble of a train. Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning in a way it never had before. She slipped the envelope back into her coat and sat down on the cold ground a few feet away, ignoring the damp. They talked then, not about the wall, but about ordinary things. Where he'd grown up, how long he'd been on the streets, how easily life could tilt and throw you off balance. When she finally stood to leave, she felt changed, though she couldn't yet name how. "I won't forget what you did," she said. "I didn't ask you to," Elias replied. As she walked back toward the lights of the town, Clara knew one thing with certainty: she couldn't go back to the way things were. Gratitude, she realized, wasn't a feeling to be carried quietly. It was a responsibility, and she intended to honor it in a way that would shock far more than just herself. The courthouse steps had never held so many people. By late morning, the square was packed with shop owners, workers on their lunch breaks, reporters with microphones raised, and curious neighbors leaning from windows above. Word had spread that Clara Whitmore was making an announcement, and in a town where her name was stitched into buildings and businesses alike, that meant something big. A temporary podium stood at the center, flanked by town officials who looked both important and uneasy. Clara stepped forward, her expression calm but resolute. The murmur of the crowd softened into silence. She didn't begin with legal language or corporate statements. Instead, she told the story from the beginning: the sound of the wall cracking, the helplessness of being trapped, the sudden force that saved her life. She spoke of waking at night still hearing the crash, knowing she shouldn't be alive. Cameras clicked. People leaned closer. "There's a word we use too easily," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Hero. We usually attach it to uniforms or titles. But the man who saved me had neither." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, already sensing where this was going. She gestured toward the side of the square. Elias stepped forward hesitantly, wearing a clean shirt that still didn't quite hide how thin he was. He looked overwhelmed by the sea of faces turned toward him. Whispers broke out as recognition spread, some from memory, others from stories retold. He kept his eyes low, hands clenched, as if ready to disappear again at any moment. Clara continued, When I found him, he refused money. Not because he was proud, but because he understood something many of us forget, that dignity matters. Her voice wavered for the first time, and she paused, steadying herself. I own property in this town. More than I need. Today, I'm using that ownership to make something right. An official stepped forward with a folder. Clara took it and held it up so the cameras could see. This building, she said, naming an old warehouse near the river, now belongs to Elias. Gasps erupted. Someone laughed in disbelief. Others clapped, uncertain at first, then louder. Elias looked up sharply, shaking his head. I didn't, he began, but Clara raised a hand gently. It's not charity, she said, meeting his eyes. It's partnership. She explained the plan then. The warehouse would be renovated into a shelter and workshop, offering beds, meals, job training, and paid work to people living on the streets. Elias wouldn't just be a symbol. He would be employed as its director, paid a fair salary, trusted to shape the place with the same humanity he'd shown instinctively that day. The crowd was no longer quiet. Applause rolled through the square, mixed with tears and stunned laughter. Reporters shouted questions, but Clara ignored them, turning fully toward Elias. You said helping means letting people keep their dignity, she said softly. This is me listening. Elias stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him harder than the falling wall ever had. He saw faces in the crowd he recognized, men and women from the streets, watching from the edges, hope flickering where there had been none. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to make speeches, he said finally, his voice rough. But I know how it feels to be forgotten. If this place exists, it won't forget anyone. That was enough. The applause came again, louder than before. In the weeks that followed, the town changed in small but unmistakable ways. Volunteers showed up to help renovate the warehouse. Local businesses donated materials and time. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the homeless now stopped to talk, to listen. Elias moved into a small apartment attached to the shelter, still walking the same streets but no longer unseen. On opening day, rain fell lightly, tapping against fresh windows. The shelter doors opened to warmth, clean beds, and the smell of food cooking. Elias stood just inside, greeting each person by name. Clara watched from the back, knowing the shock the town had felt wasn't about wealth or generosity. It was about the realization that one brave act, answered with responsibility, could rewrite lives, and remind an entire community of who they could be.